Well, Freud asserted that humanity has undergone three great wounds. Man's pride, man's narcissism, have been wounded by three great personalities, namely Copernicus, Darwin, and Freud himself. We know that the Copernican revolution had removed man from the center of the universe. We know that Darwin had denied that mankind was the result of a special and unique act of creation. Finally, Freud emphasized the supremacy of the unconscious in determining human behavior. Essentially, man is not a rational being. Man is not at the center of creation, and he is not the result of a single act of creation by a benevolent divinity. So, two further questions suggest themselves. How is that the individual can respond to these three wounds? How can the individual respond to these three wounds? What are the prospects for society as a whole after Freud's discovery of the unconscious? Finally, as Freud suggested, will man be able to accept these three facts without falling into the arms of religion, conceived as a refuge from the truth? Now, talking about the three narcissistic wounds, as we mentioned earlier, Freud proposed in 1930 that the human race had endured three great narcissistic wounds. The first of these wounds was carried out by Copernicus, a Polish astronomer, who discredited the belief that Earth was at the center of the universe. He did so when he was developing the theory that Earth is a moving planet which revolves around the sun. Darwin, it's talking about a second great wound, Darwin inflicted, using his theory of evolution, inflicted a second great wound because it demonstrated that man is simply a later descendant of an earlier animal species rather than a special entity of creation. He is not chosen by God directly, and he has not been created as an image of God himself. Freud's discovery of the unconscious. Now we come to Freud. I would just like to point out to everybody the picture I chose here. As I was saying, Freud's discovery of the conscious drives and instincts, which motivate how human beings function, provoked a third narcissistic wound. With this revelation, Mad could no longer assume that his behavior was simply ruled by conscious determinants that were fully under his control. So he established the idea that we are sort of governed by an entity which is almost totally unconscious and uncontrollable. So in Freud's psychoanalytic theory of personality, the unconscious mind is a reservoir of feelings, of thoughts, of urges, memories, which cannot be grasped by conscious awareness. As you can see, it is represented as a sort of iceberg, and the conscious element of the iceberg is only the top part, which is only the smallest part. So, according to Freud, the unconscious continues to influence our behavior and experience, even though we are unaware of these underlying influences. We only have a vague idea of our unconscious wishes because of the action exerted by censorship. Censorship, as we can see in the next slide, censorship is a force in our minds which excludes from consciousness anything which may displease it. By anything I mean tendencies, desires, recollections, emotions, sometimes even perceptions. Such contents are described as repressed. Repressed contents remain unconscious, and if one attempts to bring them into the subject's consciousness, one provokes a resistance, as psychoanalysts know very well. Every time one tries to interpret a dream, a childhood memory, a symptom, resistance is what the first thing we have to confront with. So censorship is at work in any given moment of our life. However, it is easier to see censorship at work when we are dreaming. During the night, there is a so-called relaxation of repression. So the unconscious impulse, which is pushing its way into consciousness, tries to come to consciousness when dreaming, is somehow repressed. But repression, the repressive action of the ego, is not abolished totally in sleep. It is only very reduced. So resistance does exist, but it is not so strict. And the latent dream thoughts, so we have a latent content, which is the content which is not directly available to our consciousness. The latent, as I was saying, the latent content, the latent dream thoughts are altered by censorship, and they are softened by censorship into what comes out as a puzzling manifest content, which is the dream itself, so that the forbidden meaning of the dream remains totally unrecognizable. So what happens, what is the relationship between censorship and the repressed? So censorship is not an institution peculiar to dream life. Censorship is at work in any given moment. Conflicts between desires and what is socially acceptable dominate our whole mental life. We would be overwhelmed by anxiety if we didn't find a way of hiding all the displeasing contents to ourselves. And we are afraid of finding out about our inner conflicts. That is why we resist interpretation, because interpretation is something which is something uncomfortable, something which would highlight our weaknesses, and we don't want to show ourselves that we are weak. So the resistance against the interpretation of dreams, the resistance against parapraxis or resistance against symptoms and so on and so forth, is a clear sign of censorship at work. This is actually stated quite well in the new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis in 1933 by Freud himself. So, the unconscious. The unconscious speaks its own language. The unconscious has a peculiar type of language which we find is not totally obscure to us, and has a lot to do with the language used by artists in literature or in paintings. As I was saying, the unconscious speaks its own language. The language of unconscious is characterized by two phenomena. These two phenomena are called condensation and displacement. So let's have a look at condensation. Dynamically, Freud represented a picture in which repressed desires seek satisfaction. But since censorship forbids their fulfillment, the unconscious finds a way to satisfaction by modifying the form of the prohibited wish, leaving the content unaltered. That is why there is a difference between the manifest content and the latent content. The two principles that govern the transformation from the latent content to the manifest content are exactly condensation and displacement. Condensation, as you can see in this picture, is a sort of fusion of several elements into one. It closely resembles a metaphor, for example. You can see elements which sort of merge together. And like metaphors, it conveys multiple meanings. This characteristic of condensation is at the basis of psychic phenomena and can be observed in dreams, but not just in dreams, in parapraxis, for example, in symptoms, or, as I said earlier, in any creative work of art, including, a piece of work, a piece of literature, a short story, anything. The other process is displacement. The displacement is one of the methods by which the repressed content returns to consciousness in a hidden way. For example, in dreams, the emotions associated with threatening impulses or with prohibited impulses are often transferred elsewhere. That is, they are displaced. That is why apparently trivial elements in the manifest dream seem to cause extraordinary distress. Displacement functions very similarly to metonymy. In both processes, a quality or a part of the idea to be represented is transferred to the object which represents that idea. So, for example, if the dream portrays a specific item of clothing, which is normally worn by a specific person, this may be a hint to signify that particular person. So, the specific item of clothing actually signifies the person that normally is wearing that item of clothing. The dream refers to that person without having necessarily to represent it. So the dream wants to hide, the manifest content of the dream wants to hide any reference to that person, but sort of betrays itself by hinting at that person using the item of clothing. Okay. Now, having seen all this, we should look into what we can do as a personal research. And the question now is, are we conscious? If we are conscious only of a small portion of our personalities, how can we be sure we can represent reality at all? The second question is, if our perceptions of reality are altered by our own needs and desires, reality can only be subjective. So each of us would have a different reality because our own inner feelings, our own inner impulses do actually alter our perception of reality. So how can we represent reality at all? How can we be objective? And then, can science, which is supposed to be objective, can science be considered exact if all human processes are distorted by the lens of our own fears, of our own desires, wishes? And then again, how can the artist represent the reality of the soul? The reality of the soul is something extremely complicated and cannot be narrated or cannot be dealt with as it was dealt with before Freud's discovery. And how can the novelist describe human consciousness moving away from the supposed objective reality of the 19th century positivist observer to the undermining and disorienting subjective point of view of modern man. So these questions do suggest themselves and are key, are fundamental to any study of modernism. So the task I propose is to read the extracts proposed by your English teacher, French teacher, German teacher, Italian teachers, and discuss with your classmates how the modernist writers try to answer all these previous questions.